detail because of forthcoming legal proceedings. But after the news about Finsbury Park broke, both extremist Muslims and the far right took to the internet to use it to stoke up tension and division. So our first discussion today is, how do we stop the rise in hate after terror incidents? Well, joining me here in the studio are Professor Ben Carrington, a sociologist specialising in race, gender and culture, Ruth Dudley-Edwards, a journalist and broadcaster, Shaista Aziz is a writer and comedian, and Tom Slater is the deputy editor of Spiked Online. Welcome to you all. Ben, I'm going to come to you first. We've had a string of incidents in the last few months. What sort of atmosphere has that created?
I think it's a very fragile atmosphere. I mean, it's an atmosphere in which people are frightened and scared, understandably so. But I think how we discuss these issues is really important. I think there's a number of narratives out there that we need to kind of unpack. One of them is this notion that far-right extremism is a new phenomenon and that suddenly emerged in the past weeks or months or so. And that's simply not the case. I mean, we're here not too far away from Soho, where the so-called nail bomber, David Copeland, went out and killed 3 people, injured scores more, and deliberately targeted areas, you know, the gay area in Soho, Brick Lane in East End and Brixton. You think of Andreas Breivik in Norway, who killed 77 people. So there's been a long history of far-right extremism that isn't new. I think the other thing to say is that many people deny the existence of Islamophobia. So how can we begin to address the context if we deny the very existence of the phenomenon?
Let's get to that first point. How did the media report those cases of the far-right extremism, in your views?
You tend to find in these moments that they are isolated as a lone wolf. Mental health issues are immediately kind of put onto the agenda, and they don't get to stand in for all white people. The ways in which, when we do see examples of Islamic-inspired terrorism, all of Islam
blaming the media.
The media's been appalling on these issues.
Ruth, you're a journalist. It's you and your colleagues and your peers. It's your fault.
Fortunately, I'm not a newspaper editor, so I don't take the rap on any of it.
Would you blame the media?
I would always blame the media, actually, for concurring in covering up discussion. I mean, I think that's been one of the great problems we've had for the last couple of decades. We have not been honest in conversation. This thing that every time there's an exhibition of Islamism and Islamic extremism, everybody says it's got nothing to do with Islam. That's what the politicians say, and that is rubbish. We've got to talk about the truth. I think what we should be emphasising is what a terrific country this is and how extraordinarily tolerant it is. I was looking at Pew Research organisation recently on European countries' attitude to Muslims, and the UK were least negative of the 10 countries I looked at. So you had negative responses in Hungary of something like 70%. You were down to 27% in the UK. Absolutely, it's a great tradition of tolerance, and let's applaud it.
It paints a positive picture. Shaista, the media, are they reporting terrorism and far-right extremism, which many people say is terrorism, fairly?
Well, the first thing to point out is context. So when some terrorism is described as a lone wolf or crazed individuals or whatever, however it's couched, the context is missing. So the context is that there's been a 5-fold increase in reported hate crime in the City of London. Our Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has said that terrorism is terrorism. He's absolutely right. Post-Manchester, there's been a 500% increase in hate crime. We need to make sure that when we're reporting on these issues, this context is there. There is a mounting catalogue of hate crime, reported hate crime, taking place in this country.
Is that because of the way it's reported?
Well, the media, and obviously the media is a big term to use, right? We have to break that down. But there is a lot of very inflammatory coverage and a lot of information that's being spun in an inaccurate way, which definitely is feeding into the misinformation.
Tom, is the inflammatory coverage that some people say is flaring up terrorism and reaction, is that to blame?
I don't think it is to blame, and I think there's a tremendous double standard in relation to these things. As Ruth has already gestured to, whenever there is an Islamist attack, people are quick to say, and rightly so, that you shouldn't extrapolate to all Muslims, that you shouldn't extrapolate to the religion itself necessarily. We need to talk about these things carefully. I'd agree with that. And yet, as soon as there's something which at least appears to be a far-right extremist attack, instantly you don't just hear discussion about extremist publications. You hear discussion about the Daily Mail, about The Sun. You see cartoons in broadsheet newspapers showing the van that was used in this attack with the Daily Mail and The Sun masthead plastered on the side of it. And I think what we're seeing in relation to this is the far-right threat is being defined down in many respects. And at the same time, what I think it expresses is is a contempt for white working class people who are seen as a kind of pogrom in waiting, and all they need to see is one Katie Hopkins column to hop into. I think that's deeply disturbing.
Ben, your response to that?
I'd agree that we need to kind of disaggregate when we use the term the media. It's too broad. But it's ludicrous to pretend that the Mail and the Sun are the defenders of the white working class. If anyone's done more to denigrate the white working class, it's actually those publications.
I'm not suggesting they're
and actually,
defending
part of
it,
the
I'm
problem
just
is
saying.
actually is precisely the slippage between the right and the far right. I actually don't think these are far right extremists. If you look at their views, they would say Islam doesn't belong in Europe. The problem is caused by migration. The problem is multiculturalism. Positions that are widespread on the Daily Mail, in the Sun, on Spikes magazine. It's actually the right and the far right have actually blurred, and that's actually part of the problem right now.
So the gap between Spikes magazine and many other publications is actually slipping quite closer to the far right.
Well, that's a ludicrous accusation. First of all, Spikes is a progressive humanist magazine. We're not right-wing hate peddlers by any stretch of the imagination. You can tell that we don't have a particularly pronounced problem with far-right extremism in this country, to the point in which when people are trying to talk up the threat of it, they have to define everything down. You've heard over the past week, you heard people like Douglas Murray, someone who I disagree with on many counts, but nevertheless being referred to in the same breath as Anjem Choudhury. As far as I can tell, Douglas Murray has not been criminalised for expressing support for terrorist groups. This kind of slippage, to me, demonstrates one of the things that we can take some heart from, which is the story of far-right extremism in this country over the past 30, 40 years is one of terminal decline.
That's not
and
true.
it is
not
true.
true.
If you think about, if you're going from the 1970s NF types to the BNP, all these things have collapsed. In the main, what we've got left is very sad protest groups like the EDO in central London yesterday, who could barely get 50 people to a national
So what about the hate
demonstration.
crime that Shaista talks about?
There is much evidence that shows that far-right extremists are using the internet in a similar way to Islamist extremists. They are gathering online. They are connecting with other groups in Europe. This is not true to say that the threat is going down. It's actually going up. If you look at what the security minister said in relation to the attack on Finsbury Park, he actually said that the government is aware of far-right groups operating. You know, we cannot deny that this is happening, and we cannot say that it's going down. It's not going down.
OK, we'll get your response in a minute, Tom. Divided opinion here. Emma, what have you got for us?
Well, I'm joined now by Fayez Mughal from Tal Mama, an organisation which monitors incidents of hate crimes against Muslims. Good morning to you, Fayez.
Good morning.
Have you got evidence that hate crimes against Muslims have gone up?
Well, what we have is evidence that there are large spikes and peaks when there are major national and international incidences. The baseline certainly is rising, but there's very large spikes and troughs are there predominantly after major Islamist terrorist attacks.
So the numbers are up. I mean, where are they up to at the moment, and who perpetrates these crimes against Muslims?
Well, most of the hate incidences, we've got to make a clear distinction. There are hate crimes and hate incidences, and people can report in if they are targeted because of a characteristic of theirs. Most of them are, we would call, sadly, opportunistic. People see somebody who's visibly from the Muslim community and say something. Some vast majority of these incidences would be general abuse, and thankfully the number of assaults is small. So we'd see these large numbers of incidences straight after major national incidences, major terrorist attacks in our country.
So are they up at the moment?
They are up at the moment. After Manchester, they were very high. We reported over 530% increase 7 days before versus 7 days after. After London Bridge, again, they went up. There was a spike there. But what we didn't see after the Westminster terrorist attack was any form of a spike. And we're looking into that because that's quite unique. Something didn't happen around hate crime post-Westminster.
And what do you think the long-term effect of those Islamophobia attacks is on the Muslim community in Britain?
Well, the long-term impacts are they create a sense of fear. They create a sense where Muslim women, in particular visible Muslim women, curtail their mobility. They don't go out after work. We have some Muslim women who are changing or taking off the headscarf. The sense of fear is the real impact. It's really wide at the moment, and really it's to get that into perspective. And the reality is that hate crime, when it takes place, is more about general abuse, and we need to get that sense of fear into perspective. However, let me also say there is also a general sense where communities start to distrust themselves if these incidences, these hate crimes happen time after major Islamist attacks. So that sense of distrust also impacts on communities and how they perceive each other.
That's very interesting. Fayez Mughal, thank you very much for that.
Emma, it's a sense of fear, a sense of distrust. How much is social media to blame for that, Tom?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things which it was useful that Fires actually pointed that out in relation to this, because one of the big problems is that when hate crimes and hate incidents are reported, I think it's often quite misleading. People assume that there's been a 500-fold rise in physical attacks, and often what it comes down to is verbal abuse and abuse on social media, all of which is horrendous and should be condemned in the strongest terms. But my concern is that in this discussion, that is often conflated with violent attacks, or at least no one takes the effort to try and differentiate out those parts. And if we're talking about people feeling anxious, I think that if you constantly talk up the threat of violent Islamophobia, of far-right extremism, that's going to do far much more damage to communities and their sense of cohesion than dealing with these things appropriately and talking about them on their sense of scale. It's reckless to talk up this threat as much as people are.
Ruth, there are Muslims who will not feel safe in this country, and that's not a good thing, whether it's social media or actual attacks.
Well, and part of the reason is what they're being fed by their own communities in terms of, exactly, hate crime as opposed to hate incidents. Somebody shouting abuse is nasty, very bad manners. It is not to be conflated with violence.
So is a tweet, so is an abusive tweet.
Absolutely, but it's all over the internet. I mean, the abuse I get every day.
But if it's targeted at Muslims, it's bad, isn't it?
If it's targeted at anybody, it's bad. Of course it's bad. And of course there's lots of that. They're very sad people on the internet. But we've got to get it in context. I speak as an Irish immigrant who lived here through all the bombs in the 70s and 80s and was astounded by the tolerance of the English. And, you know, if occasionally somebody said something slightly rude about my accent, I didn't report it to anybody as a hate crime. You know, we've got to get a sense of perspective. And I think telling Muslims how welcome they are in this country and telling Muslims what a tolerant country it is and that they should be proud of it would be a start.
Ben, you've spent a lot of time in America, haven't you? Similar tensions there. Can we learn anything from them? And what's it like in American society at the moment?
Actually, we have similar conversations in the US right now. You have this similar type of I think, patronising discourse towards Muslims, telling them that Islamophobic threats, kids being terrorised at school, being victimised, is just a form of bad manners, and that Islamophobia doesn't exist. So actually I think you find some really similar parallels to what's happening in the US to the UK right now. And I would just say, I mean, I agree that it's important to distinguish, you know, between not conflating Islamophobia and attacks kind of too broadly, but sometimes I think the opposite takes place from the right, when they define it so narrowly that only, you know, someone explicitly claiming to be attacking someone, you know, because they're Muslim and inflicting bodily damage or even death gets to count, and everything else simply doesn't count. I mean, that's a ridiculous standard. Otherwise, most things in which we would normally call forms of persecution and hate just wouldn't qualify.
I'll come to you in a moment on that, Shasta, but let's find out what people are saying at home, Emma.
Well, people are getting in touch, and what we really do like is with some solutions. So thank you very much to Sarah, who says if we want to change division in society, we should start with school playgrounds. Nothing is done to stop the segregation that exists there. Mike says honesty, that's how it starts. Honesty is where any constructive conversation begins. But Robert says, I don't think we can stop a rise in hate. Some people simply lack the cognitive capacity to understand that they're lashing out at innocent people. Jim says we should round up radicals and stop them walking our streets. For those who say they have to commit a crime first, they already have done by spreading hate. And Chris, I'm sorry, it's not a very lovely comment to end on from our comments from you at home, and we will like them coming in to keep them coming in. Multiculturalism doesn't work because not all cultures are compatible. Sean.
Emma, well, they're going to spark a debate. Not all cultures are compatible.
Well, I think the most important thing here is we cannot dismiss the lived experiences that British people in this country are going through. I spend a lot of time talking to lots of people as a journalist, and I've had lots of women contact me in the past few months telling me that they're nervous, they're scared about going out because they visibly look like Muslims. I think this is a disgrace, and I think to say if anyone's suggesting that it's not happening or it's not happening in the way that the police, the figures show, then that's simply not true.
So what is sparking that fear? Is it social media? Is it reading the papers?
No,
or is it actual attacks?
It's lived experiences. That's what's sparking it. I mean, I myself was subjected to a hate crime last week. The police are investigating it. I urge anyone who is facing physical or verbal abuse on the streets, racial, physical or verbal abuse, to let the police deal with it. In the past 2 years, I've been to the police twice. This isn't a figment of my imagination. I had an individual try and punch me in the face. A man first abused me racially, and then he tried to punch me in the face in my own home city. This has never happened to me before. And something is going on here. While I absolutely agree and accept that we shouldn't talk things up to make people anxious and nervous, the other thing that we shouldn't be doing is pretending this is not happening. There is context behind everything.
How can we heal the divide in society, Tom?
I think we need to stop treating the public like idiots. I think that's one of the most things that's been so striking about all of this. In a situation where, in about the past 2 years, about 36 people have been killed in terror attacks. Now, excluding the case that we can't talk about, one of those was by a far-right extremist. I think a lot of people in the British public are bemused that we even seem to keep having this discussion about far-right extremism in the context of what's happening, because I think it is driven by, first of all, an assumption that Muslim communities are unable to talk about this, despite the fact that we all know that this is a very small problem within that community. And then the second prejudice that drives it is a belief that the white working class are, again, some sort of pogrom in waiting. I believe Muslim, non-Muslim citizens are grown up enough to have this discussion without having to constantly deflect attention somewhere else.
Tom, thank you. And I'm afraid we are out of time. We could continue this for quite a long time, couldn't we? You're chomping at the bit there. But we are out of time this week. Many thanks to all our...
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.